This is a paper which is really an act of faith in some instinct which made me go for a certain image when Derrida gently but very, very firmly said I needed to say what I was intending to talk about. I chose the image as one sometimes chooses a title without knowing quite why, and then I was stuck to it, or stuck to it like a raft in a flood. So in preparing the talk, I've just counted on my own lack of imagination, hoping I could presume that if this caught my attention, it was because it reminded me of and momentarily crystallized what I had already been thinking about. What I'm going to try to do then is just work out what spoke to me, as they say. Work out and articulate the stories I was already intending to tell without quite knowing it. Stories which I hope are not just my own. As a way into articulating what arrested me in that image, let me start by bringing in some more recent images. This will be my way of starting with a title, or at least starting with the first word, flood. I'll get to rights later. The term flood for me evoked two things. First, a biblical reference, belied by the French translation as crue, but I'll come back to the Bible nevertheless. And secondly, it evoked the question, when does quantitative change equal qualitative change? Does the spread of rights talk or the translation into that vocabulary of more and more situations and problems at some point change the content or the point of that talk? And what of the quantitative change in the production and circulation of images? Or to put it in terms we've all heard before, what happens when anyone with a phone becomes a photojournalist? It seems to me we had one answer to that question recently via the more recent images I was just referring to, those of the chemical attack in Syria. It's not the first time, of course, that images of victims have been recorded by those on the scene, but it does seem to me that the circulation of those images is a moment of intensification which may end up counting as change in the dynamics of that circulation. Obama, briefing the Senate Intelligence Committee in anticipation of a congressional vote authorizing the use of military force, brought 13 videos to make his case. The committee later posted them on their site, justifying that as necessary because the public should know. The message seemed to be that the public could and should know that these images make anyone who watches them know. The images were presented to explain or justify in advance a decision to use force, but also, I think, to justify it as a decision which, in a sense, almost didn't need to be made, had already been made by the images, at least in the sense that if it were indeed made by Congress, that would be, in some sense, merely a ratification or an acknowledgement of something which had happened as soon as one saw the videos. Labeled graphic, in other words, should induce nausea, these images are held to have the power to issue, if not a categorical, at least a pretty strong imperative. Looking at the images would, the logic goes, I think, I'm reconstructing. Looking at the images would remove the difficulty from the decision. What's compelling about them is not just that they're graphic images of what it looks like when a lot of people are dead with no blood, but that they constitute, in some sense, what I'd call intelligence without intelligence. The images then were passed around because they were held to be precisely not the sort which Colin Powell famously took to the UN. They say what happened because they come not through institutional reconstruction or expert extrapolation, but as if directly. That there were images of the victims taken by those on the spot was crucial, but the quantity of these images was crucial in their quality. Had there been one or two, they could have been fakes. I'm not sure how Obama came up with the number 13, but in any case, those 13 were held to stand in for many, many others. As we were told, quote, these videos were selected to depict a representative range of YouTube content. That's the measure. The large numbers of those who registered images with the instruments at hand became, in this instance, precisely what gave them credibility. As though they came to us directly, straight from the scene, because they're mediated only by people whose names don't matter, whose credibility is thought to stem precisely from the fact that they're each one of many who could have produced equivalent images. The implicit argument is that precisely because these images came through people who acted as unthinking transmission mechanisms, it is because of that that we get the story straight. The images are entitled, those who record them have no particular titles, and it is in that doubly untitled capacity that they are entitled not only to our attention, but in some sense to our submission, the images. Indeed, compliance with the program was the demanded outcome when Obama, etc., were saying, we cannot not believe we have been shown the images speak for themselves. Okay, now let's look at the image that I said I would talk about. From July 5th, a few days after Morsi has been removed, a time when there's lots of coverage of the debate around whether the US should or would or could have to cut off part of the aid to Egypt subject to congressional rules. The image is of Tahrir Square, a shot from afar and above, nighttime, so the people milling around are figures, not to say figurants. Nothing special except big green letters projected onto a facade. They spell, "It is not a coup." The image made me laugh. It seemed quirky, crazy hopeful, a little desperate, already hard to believe, but also thereby making one pause to wonder what difference belief might make and what optimism or cynicism might be attached to or imparted by this speech act, this constructed image. Tahrir is, of course, one of the squares Eric referred to on the first day, iconic not just of itself, but of the movement of the squares. It's news in itself when it is flooded with people. It has effects. In particular, it's expected to have effects if all the figures are not just a bunch of people, but somehow the people manifesting itself. If the square with people becomes a visible trace of the force behind events outside the square. But to determine what it is we see when we see an image of figures in a space bordered by buildings, we of course need editorial intervention, information, interpretation. Some of that information and interpretation can be conveyed or constructed by where we view the image. Some of it comes with a label, a caption, accompanying the picture, or a légende, as one might say in French. In this particular image, the caption has been integrated into the picture. It's already integrated by those who, projecting on the building, build the caption into the picture they make, relying on all the technology which will fix and relay the image to screens around the world. Taking on the fact that images are made to say things, those who write, "It is not a coup," into the pictures which have yet to be taken, writing the caption for the image of masses in Tahrir, claim the images of the square that day for a certain cause. The inscription virtually makes the images which will go to phones as well as cameras connected to news media, and makes them as images which will speak out, defending a certain claim about what this is a sign of. Virtually making an image which will speak for itself, the words on the building attempt to anticipate or circumvent those who might make the images from Cairo that day say something else. So we have there two simple examples of images circulating and their power to say whether a red line has been crossed. Because of course, whether or not it is a coup is another red line issue. Coup marking the exit from the space of acceptable modes of change within the rule of law. And of course, that's why it was in the rules about aid in the first place. It's a version of the unforgivable crime, as Kant put it. It would seem that these two instances provide two theories of how and when images can speak for themselves. In the case of the dead, or importantly, dying bodies, the theory is that they do so directly, speaking for themselves in the way facts are said to. In the case of the crowds in the public space, the answer is only with a little help. The image has to be made to do so. Perhaps it requires a trick. On the one hand, images are attributed a capacity to bring the story directly. On the other hand, an image which makes explicit and attempts to work with the principle that to get from image to story always takes some editing. These are two familiar theories from a long time, and in particular from the last 2 days. And my question here is, of course, how these two theories of images, two theories about images, are related. How do they fit together? How is it that these two theories, which one can describe as incompatible, fit together enough for both to be intelligible and equally familiar? That's what I'm going to try to work out. Well, say something about. So, we could approach this by giving slightly less simplistic readings of the examples that I've just given. Complicating, for instance, the distinction I made according to which the image which looks like a contemporary art installation superimposed on a news photograph is the only one produced by embedding in a caption in the picture to come. It wouldn't take much to argue, if one were so inclined, that in the other case also there is an anticipation of the image by the caption. Might we not at least wonder whether Obama's off-the-cuff remark about chemical weapons and red lines didn't in its own way almost already conjure up the images of dead children splayed as if under an evil spell, or lines of white-wrapped corpses? Didn't those somehow become images waiting to happen, or waiting to happen on phones? That would be one way, then, into the problem. Another way would be to dig a little bit into the complications of speaking for oneself as an expression. Because if you linger with it at all, the non-intuitive and contradictory aspects of that expression quickly proliferate. It can mean of things that they don't need words, they give direct intuition, not indirect arguments, but it can just as easily be taken to signify not the absence of words, but on the contrary, very effective advocacy. They speak for themselves could be translated, these are really good speeches. And just as a note, I think it has to be about good speeches when we're talking about images. I don't know, this is just an aside, but I realized I couldn't quite see myself muttering as I look at an image what I definitely can mutter when I'm reading, namely, speak for yourself. In any case, I'm not going to go in either of those directions. What I'd like to do instead is take a step back and think about the very fact that this question of how immediate or how mediated what the images say is such an important issue. What space are we in that we keep coming across this as an interesting problem? And to get to the second word in the title, does this have anything to do with rights? So I'm going to turn, for a little help, to Derrida and to his contentions about globalization. When thinking about the world we live in as characterized by the phenomenon referred to as globalization, Derrida insists on using as much as possible the standard French word mondialisation. Partly, this is simply to show there are still alternatives to the growing dominance of English, a dominance attested to by its naming what is happening. And because in French people also talk about globalisation, but one could insist on the good old French word mondialisation. Partly, Derrida refers to the standard French term because there's a reference to world, monde, rather than globe. And reducing the world to the globe is, in a sense, I think for him, to have already bought into the paradigm of the particular connections between technoscience, national international law, and market capitalism, which one should be attempting to describe and engage. To highlight that one can only understand contemporary globalization by considering a world other than a mere sphere, a mundus older than the Enlightenment globe, Derrida inserts a reference to Latin, coining the term mondialatinisation. The gesture towards Rome is not just towards the Rome of Stoic cosmopolitanism as opposed to the Kantian version, it is also crucially towards the Vatican. For Derrida, this is essential. This globalization is a fundamentally Christian phenomenon. We are indeed talking about a Christian flood. And like the flood in the Bible, it doesn't just happen to be very big. Its quantitative extension is part of its quality. According to Derrida, what progresses to cover the surface of the earth is Christian, including, if not especially, in the Enlightenment secularized version. Christianity after the death of God being, after all, just one more iteration of what Christianity was all about from the start, the religion of after the death of God. I can't go into much detail here about Derrida's take on mondialatinisation, but I'm just going to pull a few points from some short remarks he made at a round table on religion and media. In that context, Derrida begins by evoking the story of Abraham and Isaac. Coming back to what he says is, quote, in a certain manner more decisive than the terrible story of the son to be put to death by his father, close quote. So what's more decisive than that terrible story? Abraham's silence. Quote, he never spoke to anyone, above all not to Sarah, not to his family, to no one in the domestic or public arena, close quote. As though the essential test was secrecy. Insisting that as readers we pay attention to that silence, even that we consider it what is most extraordinary in the story, Derrida glosses, quote, God told him, Abraham, the following, whether explicitly or not. I want to see if, even in the most extreme ordeal, the possible demanded death of your favorite son, you will be able to keep secret the absolutely invisible singular relation that you are to have with me. Close quote. Or Derrida translates again what he claims we can know with certainty God said to Abraham, quote, above all, no journalists, surtout pas de journalistes, nor any confessors, nor, of course, any psychoanalysts. That is what God said. And everything, adds Derrida, suggests that Abraham understood this perfectly. He understood that the great betrayal would be to turn his ordeal into news. Now, Derrida uses this and the fact that, as he puts it, quote, this event remains the major reference for Judaism and for Islam, but not at all naturally for Christianity, not in the same manner, to introduce the idea that there is a very particular relationship between media and the religion of Christ. The religion, of course, of the first one to bring, or the one to bring the good news, gospel, good news. That special relation can be observed or described in a number of ways. Derrida will claim, for instance, that it is specific to Christianity that religious events can happen on television. You can have Mass on television or evangelical miracles on television. His claim, I don't know, would be that that actually doesn't happen in other religions. Or if it does, it's because they've become Christian. But it's not quite circular, but that would take too long. But more generally, he takes the live of television to be a translation of a Christian code of real presence, Eucharist, transubstantiation, etc. Okay, we've got to skip the details, so I'll go to a formalization of his hypothesis, his analysis. Leads to the proposition that television is caught up in, propulsed by, but also producing and progressing by extending, quote, a conflictual theater, close quote. Theater. The conflict is of the sort that Derrida will use the term autoimmunity to describe, but he also puts it this way, quote, protest against technology is one of the major meanings of the technology called television. And television here is a shorthand, not for all media, but certainly for television and, as he anticipates already, that which will come after it, which he identifies essentially around digital circulation of images, with national and international components and constraints. That's television. Television in that sense is, for Derrida, all about the conflict between bringing things live and erasing the mediation that requires. It's all about, quote, appealing to faith at the moment of letting know, close quote. It works through the contradiction, in both senses of working through, between no faith required on the one hand and faith required. It's a, you don't have to believe you can see, that necessarily relies on an act of faith in the technological mediation. The Christian problem with immediacy, thus on Derrida's account, becomes the crucial contradiction television and its successors has to navigate, a contradiction ever more prevalent and pressing as the problem with globalization, i.e. the progression of the strange and somewhat contingent alliance forged between Christianity and technoscience. If Derrida is right, then having to articulate the fantasy of direct communication and the necessity of mediation is, in some important sense, the specificity of the contemporary flood of images, rights, markets, and technology as a markedly Christian phenomenon. Derrida can, I think, help think about the languages in which we look at but also look to images, because not only does he point out and indeed help formalize the tension which we've been repeatedly encountering, images can provide direct apprehension only insofar as there is mediation. He also invites us to consider that this is a productive tension, or perhaps even one formula for the productive tension of globalization, the tension producing the Latin flooding the world, carried by English or the internet, and as a movement which has quantity built in. Now, in the last part of my talk, I want to turn, as promised, to rights, more specifically to rights claims. This is actually a little experimental, but we'll try. So to go a while longer in the direction suggested by Derrida, I'd like to attempt a transposition or a translation of the particular connection he articulates between seeing and believing, the specific connection which he takes to be the mark of the world we live in, insofar as it is the world of those who didn't get the surtout pas de journaliste message. Seeing as believing is a phrase usually used to signify you don't have to believe if you see, that seeing is a good substitute for belief. But Derrida pushes us to hear also seeing is believing. It's already belief, and seeing is faith. That's the logic I'm going to try to transpose, in a sense, to rights claims. In other words, the experiment here is going to be something like, can the Derrida I've just evoked, the one who, as I suggested, can help make us sense, at least in one way, of there being two stories about whether or how images speak for themselves? Can that Derrida help think about whether or how rights claims need to be made to speak for themselves, in whichever way you want to hear that made? I'll start, not necessarily because it's the best place, but because I thought I could presume it was familiar, with a reference to Hannah Arendt's famous contention that there's a difference between losing rights and losing the right to have rights. Yeah, we'll leave aside the fact that that's in terms of loss. Let's just stick to the fact that through this formulation, she distinguishes two spaces in some sense. One which is a space of rights and one outside. Two subspaces of the world, one in which there is a distribution of rights and claims can be made for a different distribution, and another subspace in which people are not even in the running for making claims about a different distribution. If we take that description to be useful, it would follow that claiming rights can be of two sorts, either claiming specific rights, new distribution within a system, or claiming to belong to or to accede to the space in which such claims can even make sense. At least analytically, one can distinguish these two cases as one way to start thinking first about different spaces in which claims are made, and second, the idea that that entails different languages. I've just described different modalities of claims as though on the one hand they're claims and on the other meta-claims, right? Claims to be able to make claims, It wouldn't be too surprising, I hope, if different arguments, terms, references, but also modalities of language were required to claim a right or to claim the right to make a claim. I think that we do actually encounter in the world these two types of claims, and that they can be associated with two modes of speaking, possibly two languages. Let's see whether I can get you to go along with this. First, on the one hand, there are claims which minimize their own claim to be making a claim. They may be demanding small adjustments or spectacular changes of the given distribution of rights. But even in the latter case, the logic, the rhetorical strategy, the mode of speaking is to present themselves as minimal. They're sort of minimal. They're not really changing anything, not really aiming to provoke huge changes either in the world or in the one receiving the claim. It's that minimal quality which is supposed to make this kind of claim work. Think of Olympe de Gouges claiming voting rights for women by arguing that if she can be executed for treason, then surely she is already a citizen and should be able to vote. In such an argument, a new right is being claimed, but as a correction which should almost go without saying if one were being logical. The right is being claimed as one only missing through oversight or inconsequence. Now, there are, of course, serious consequences in the sense of real implications of the proposed modification. That's why it took a long time. But the force of the claim would be that it is a modification only for greater coherence of the structure already in place. I think you can find plenty of examples of such claims, ones which claim to or can be claimed to speak for themselves in the sense that they present themselves as simply logical or almost intuitive, where those two come to be equivalent, just markers of immediacy. They present themselves as you don't need to subscribe to anything new, you already agree, you get it, you see it, it's just some form of oversight or blindness, poor logic or prejudice which has prevented something being visible before. But once we see it, it goes without saying. That's the first kind of, trying to make a category, right? That's the first type of claim and language it's speaking, which is minimizing its own minimizing itself in order to have more force, hiding its own force. The second type would be claims which don't say there's been a little problem we have to fix in the distribution, but that the very space of the distribution needs to be modified. This kind of claim would require expansion, new forms, bigger, better, new horizons, including more people than we ever saw before, etc. And just to insist that the distinction I'm making is an analytic one, and the claims often combine the two forms, I could go back to the Olympe de Gouges example. When arguing to claim voting rights for women, she does use the argument I referred to earlier, but she also argues appealing to lawmakers not to stop at half of humanity. The injunction there is not necessarily this should already be obvious, but while you're on a roll, let's go a lot further. Why don't we think bigger, think outside the box, and make the box, the space of rights, encompass something we hadn't anticipated? These two modes of making a claim for rights could at least very roughly be connected with Arendt's distinction, insofar as the first might be thought to take place in the space of rights to be determined, takes the space of rights to be determined. The second marshals attention to that space as part of what is at stake. The two modes, functioning in different spaces, also function, I think, in different linguistic registers, which I'm going to call here provisionally deduction and prayer. I'm not entirely happy with deduction, so maybe you'll help me come up with a better word. I would have used claim, except I'm already using it. But it's not too bad if you hear both Sherlock Holmes and Kant. That's roughly, right? And the specific Kantian sense of deduction, which has to do with the document which would prove property rights. In any case, deductions are, which we'll call them for the moment, my first kind of claim. Deductions are articulated within a space in which rights have been misdistributed. They are presented only to those who share the logic of the system taken as a given. Prayers, on the other hand, appeal to those within a given system of rights and some others. Some other, or appeal to them only insofar as they are also other than those they are within a system of rights. For instance, in sharing, capacity to turn to God or justice or morality or humanity. Okay, let me anticipate the objection. It's very, very easy to think of examples of rights claims which don't fit into the rubrics I've just proposed. And although claims made for or by or in the name of those who in Arendt's terminology do not have the right to have rights can be articulated as a denunciation of the system which appeals to a beyond, they can, and luckily are, just as often or as easily presented as an incoherence of the global rights system which should be corrected. In other words, some claims for those without the right to have rights are of the order I've called prayer, but some can, and some, and sometimes at the same time, can also be deductions, claim the legitimacy which should go without argument if only one saw clearly. Deduction and prayer as two languages in which to claim rights don't separate neatly as modes of advocacy for the two types of claim. I'll grant the objection all the more easily, as it may help me bring out what seems interesting to me about the distinction. No surprises, it's interesting where it breaks down. What I think the contamination shows is not that the distinction I've proposed is an analytic one, and that in practice, of course, claims in the real world will be various syntheses of these, although that's obviously the case. But rather that if Derrida is onto something, then clamoring for rights has to involve both deduction and prayer. In other words, the mixture of modes is not an accidental feature here of the translation into practice of theoretically distinct modes of language and spaces of claims. Rather, we should see the ways in which the claims for those who have the right to have rights on the one hand and those who do not on the other are invariably connected. But following Derrida, I would venture that perhaps the very fact that they are intimately connected is a characteristic of the world, of the moment, of the mondialatinisation we have been talking about and largely within. The fact that my distinction between clamoring for rights in the mode of deduction and in the mode of prayer is not tenable really is not, in other words, a reason not to use it if it can hold just long enough for us to see or say something about the flood of rights. Perhaps it's precisely the fact it's untenable when maybe we think it should be tenable that is interesting about the distinction. The fact that deductions depend on prayers and vice versa would be an identifying mark of contemporary rights talk. So Derrida suggested we pay attention to the ways in which the immediacy promised by the media, an immediacy which seems to obviate the need for faith, you don't have to believe because you can see, works only because there is a faith in technical, faith in the fiction of television. I've just tried to follow that suggestion in a possible translation, suggesting that we pay attention to the ways in which rights claims juggle appeals to, promises of immediacy, only by mobilizing faith in fiction technology in their own way, the fiction which is our capacity to manufacture justice. So let me, in closing, just come back for a moment to the initial image. As I mentioned, it made me laugh, and of course that laugh must have been connected to the fact that as a claim about the news, it seemed already somewhat a pipe dream to hope it was not a coup? How many people in the square that evening, writing or countersigning the proposition, could have believed it was not a coup? It was impossible not to read this apparently simple deictic in the context as at least partly tongue-in-cheek or as a fervent prayer. And the pipe dream aspect reinforced, or was itself reinforced, by the inevitable association with "this is not a pipe," focusing one's gaze on the conundrums of language and representation. The piece thus echoed questions we already have plenty of memories of, questions in and about language, but also questions about the ways words and images speak through one another in order to speak for themselves or speak against each other. The familiarity of those questions is surely what allowed me to laugh, but that was only a first reaction. And if we are going to talk about our reactions to images, we might need not to measure just what happens to the skin in the first 0.25 seconds or to our stomachs a couple of minutes later, but also what happens as the first reactions settle and sometimes unsettle us in new ways. I don't have time to talk about all that made me uncomfortable after that first laugh, but let me just say that the possibly productive discomfort does, I think, come in the time it takes for language. That can happen through closer attention to what we see in the image. You can tell I barely looked at the image, actually. The kind of attention Ronnie Broman was talking about yesterday, noticing what's in the picture from Burma was not actually starving people and corpses. But I've tried here to make the case that it can also happen through a closer attention to the long history of the soundtrack, which sometimes determines what we see. And perhaps not least to one of its elements, our attachment to news and our faith in the project of reporting. It seems to me that without attention to that long history, which will have to include thinking about the betrayal, we may not have a prayer. I finished early.